What's going on, everybody? Happy Monday. Start of a new week. This is a massive episode. Massive episode here coming out today. Let's not waste any time. This is your Sports Digest. I'm your host, Alex McNinch. This episode might be over an hour. There's a good chance. I will tell you this right now, that this is probably the most anticipated episode within the college football season preview, just because the large majority of people that I know or that will listen to this show are fans of this conference. This is the conference I'm most knowledgeable in because my team is in it. So this might be a long episode. I will have timestamps. This 100% will have timestamps in this episode. So therefore, if you're listening to this early on and you're like, oh my God, this episode is so long, there will be timestamps to where you can go to each one of your teams or each team you want to listen to and hear me speak about it. Like I said, this might be over an hour. I decided to not do an episode this past Friday just because I didn't think too many people were going to listen to it about baseball, stuff like that. So if you wanted my thoughts, you would have texted me about it probably. Otherwise, let's talk about the SEC, the conference that dominates all of football. Everybody knows it. And again, we're just going to go in alphabetical order. We're not going to try to jump around or do anything because we don't want to, upset a certain fan base that, may think that I'm saying a ranking of a team is higher than the other. So we're just going to start from the top, and we're going to start at Alabama. And everybody obviously knows the history and lineage of Alabama football, especially within the past 15 years. Last year was the first year Alabama really, you could see towards the end of the season, there was a couple of steps taken down. Obviously, you lose the game to Tennessee and you lose the game to LSU, both on the road in very close fashion, coming down to the very end. You lose a bunch of guys when it comes to the offseason. Bryce Young, obviously the number one overall pick. Jahmyr Gibbs, also a first-round pick. Will Anderson and Brian Branch on the defensive side. Will Anderson, obviously a top 5 pick. Branch was I think he was a second-round pick as well. So losing a lot of really good guys. But when you're looking at the skill position of this team, you're bringing back some really good players. Ja'Cory Brooks and Jermaine Burton, the two guys in the wide receiver core. Both guys had 600 receiving yards last year for this team. Already kind of used to how things are ran there at Alabama. You're bringing back Jace McClellan, even though you lose Jahmyr Gibbs. Jace McClellan ran for 655 last year and 7 touchdowns, so he's fully capable of taking over the starting job there at Alabama. The whole question is on this offensive side of things is, what are we doing at quarterback? I say we. What are they doing at quarterback? In the spring ball, it was all about Jalen Milroe, who last year showed some flashes of being an incredible dual-threat quarterback with just fantastic in the running game. Who was fantastic in the running game. Rushed for 265 last year on 31 attempts that he ran for. And then the other guy to look for was Ty Simpson, the other quarterback, who was a redshirt freshman. People were really questionable about him, but Milroe, I think his athleticism put him ahead there. And then late in the spring, Tyler Buckner came over to Alabama, transferring in from Notre Dame to follow his offensive coordinator, Tommy Rees, who is now the new offensive coordinator at Bama after Bill O'Brien was let go. They bring him in, and now the question is all right, we're going into week 1 here in a few weeks, and they still don't know if Milroe's the guy. They still don't know if Buckner's going to be the guy. It's a question for this Alabama team that they need to figure out pretty quickly, because week 2 they play Texas, and obviously you kind of need your whole situation at quarterback to kind of be figured out before there. But I mean, with the weapons they have, a couple of the guys already coming back, Brooks, Burton, Kobe Prince, what we haven't even talked about. They bring in Malik Benson, who is a 4-star receiver in this draft or in this recruiting class that a lot of people really like there. J.C. Latham, big guy on that offensive line who's going to help out. The offense shouldn't really be questioned in the skill position wise. It's all about the quarterback position. What are they doing there? And if you flip to the defensive side, they've got the number 1 DB in the NFL draft probably this next year, Kool-Aid McKinstry or Xavier McKinstry, whatever you want to list them as. But Kool-Aid just sounds much better or much cooler, obviously. So Kool-Aid, who is a lockdown corner, and Terrion Arnold, who is also another lockdown corner that'll pair right next to him. Both of those guys fit really well together. And then you have Dallas Turner, who's going to be playing a little bit of the high rate of a linebacker edge role, outside linebacker edge. He's going to be your main guy to look to after Will Anderson is no longer there. You're bringing back Tim Smith and Jaheim Oatis on the defensive line as well. You bring in some more guys, most notably Caleb Downs, who's a 5-star safety, and Trey Arnold, a DB, who used to be at Louisiana, I believe. He's coming in and is going to make an immediate impact. So the defensive side, you're not really too worried about as much as you are offensively. You also get a new defensive coordinator in Kevin Steele, which he gets another shot in the SEC again. So if you're looking at Alabama, their win total is set at 10.5. You're kind of looking at around 10 wins. If you're looking at their schedule, you got tough ones against Texas, Tennessee, LSU, and then always, no matter how good they are, Auburn that last week is always a toss-up game, no matter what. If you're an Alabama fan, you know that no matter how good they possibly are, that last week against Auburn is always a game you have to look out for, whether they're any good or not this year. So you're looking at 4 games that are like, okay, here's some toss-ups. But, I think around the 10-win range would be a smart thing. But they got to figure out this quarterback situation first, because that is going to be the backbone for this offense. Because last year, Bryce Young was the guy, and he was the savior. There were so many times last year where it's like, hey, if Bryce Young was not playing quarterback for this team might win 7 to 8 games, because it was so much of an underperformance from these guys. So hopefully in a second, third year for some of these other guys, maybe Milroe can figure it out, throw the ball a little bit better, be more accurate, or maybe Buckner comes in and becomes an absolute stud for this team, playing in an offensive system that he kind of already is familiar with. But I think around the 10-win range, it makes the most sense if you're Alabama. And we'll move on right over to the rival of that team in Auburn. Auburn's in an interesting situation. Obviously, Hugh Freeze in his first year at head coach with the Auburn Tigers. You're returning your starting quarterback in Robbie Ashford. You lose a couple of guys, Derek Hall, Tank Bigsby, Owen Pappoe, and Landon King, all guys that were super important to this team. But you're bringing back Ashford, like I said, who is already familiar with playing for Auburn. Jarquez Hunter is going to take over at running back now that Tank Bigsby is gone, but has experience playing last year at this level, I guess, 6.5 yards per carry last year as the backup guy. And if you kind of go to the defensive side, another couple of guys that are returning is Nehemiah Pritchett, a DB. He's one of those lockdown guys that you want to watch out for to play on Sundays. And DJ James is his complimentary guy, also there in the secondary. So those are some of the key guys you want to look at that are returning. But Robbie Ashford is not too safe, because they went out in the portal and got Peyton Thorne, former quarterback of Michigan State, who has a real good chance to battle for this job. Whether he gets the job week 1 or not against UMass, I don't know. They might roll with Ashford just because of his familiarity with playing for the team. And maybe eventually, if Ashford isn't performing to the level that is expected of him, maybe they go a different direction and put Thorne in there. But you have multiple options. You also bring in Rivaldo Fairweather, a tight end from FIU, who is very, very solid and is one of the guys to look out for this year on this team. And then at wide receiver, you bring in Caleb Burton, a guy from Ohio State, a highly ranked recruit who just couldn't figure it out, obviously playing behind so many great wide receivers there. Wanted to get out and spread his wings with a different team. And the defensive side of things is where they needed a lot of depth kind of help, I guess. So they went out and got that. Justin Rogers being one of the key guys, being one of Kentucky's top D linemen last year, bringing him over, Hugh Freeze did. And then you also went and got Austin Keys, a linebacker from Ole Miss, to help kind of shore up that depth part. He'll end up eventually starting for them. So that kind of works out in that aspect. Like I said, Jarquez Hunter is going to be one of those key guys to watch for at running back for Auburn. He's going to be one of the bright spots on this team right now. Lot of size, when it comes to the wide receivers. Camden Brown being one of the top guys returning as a sophomore, 6'3", 199. Coy Moore being another guy we haven't talked about, 6'1", 198. So they got a bunch of size there at wide receiver. Super athletic. We talked about Fairweather coming in as a tight end. He's going to be a big help to this team. And then the defensive back duo of Pritchett and James, who could be awesome. And you're bringing back both of your starting safeties and Jalen Simpson and Zion Puckett. That's also going to be a huge part for this Alabama team. But if you're kind of looking at a weak spot, it's all about the quarterback. Kind of similar to Alabama, you don't really know what you got until you figure it out when you play. Luckily for Auburn's sake, you don't play an SEC team until week 4, unlike Alabama where you're playing Texas week 2. You kind of got to figure it out. Auburn's got some time. They play UMass, Cal, and Samford at your starting 3 before you play at A&M. So you have some time to kind of figure out who you really like. You've had the rest of the offseason period to figure out preseason ramp up. That's kind of the big part there. And then the defensive line is kind of a questionable one, but Auburn always ends up producing one really good defensive tackle or defensive lineman. And I'm sure that it's going to be no different this year. Their line of wins are set at 6.5. You're kind of looking around 6-6 for this team again. I think you just play too many good teams, unfortunately, that are a little bit better than they are right now. And yeah, it's a first-year head coach. Obviously, it's not always going to be the best success, but I think you're going to find a little bit more success than expected this year. It's just all about the quarterback battle and kind of figuring out who you have there to help complement around those complementary pieces that you already have there at wide receiver, tight end, and running back. So probably around 6 wins is going to be what you're looking for if you are an Auburn fan. Moving on to another team that has some really high hopes and some hype going around them coming into this season, and that's Arkansas. Arkansas is in a really interesting situation because you have a really, really, really good starting quarterback and running back duo. KJ Jefferson being the starting quarterback, returning again. Got hurt a couple times last year, but people are expecting a lot of big things from him this year. And then Rocket Sanders, the guy at running back, is a junior. He's fantastic. One of the best running backs in the SEC, if not all of college football last year, with over 1,400 rushing yards. He's poised for another fantastic year. Arkansas is just at a situation where you've got really good guys offensively and some parts defensively, but you're not all the way sure what they have. They lose a couple guys, Trey Knox, Jalen Catalon ended up transferring to I believe, Texas, what we talked about. Keyshawn Jackson, a great wide receiver, and Drew Sanders ended up going to the draft. But luckily, you bring back KJ and Rocket Sanders, who are two really phenomenal players. And then looking at the defensive side, Torian Carter, a defensive tackle, who is really going to be poised for a breakout year his senior year this year. He's going to be relied on heavily on that D-line. And then moving back to the safety, Dwight McLaughlin, who last year showed a lot of signs of breaking out potential, I guess you could call it. They really like him a lot and are really expecting him to be that next guy as being the elder statesman of the group in the secondary room. And they also went into the transfer portal and bolstered up that secondary and D-line a little bit. They got Anthony Booker, a D-lineman from Maryland. He'll find his way in the rotation to play with them potentially this year. But most importantly, on the defensive back front, Jaheim Singletary, a DB that transferred in from Georgia, didn't get any playing time with them. Obviously transferring in conference, looking to get a little bit more playing time here at Arkansas. You'll find him play a little bit. And then another dude, Lorando Johnson, DB out of Baylor. He is going to be that secondary piece next to McLaughlin. They're expecting a lot out of him. His nickname is Snacks. So Lorando Snacks Johnson. Look out for him. He's a junior transfer from Baylor. And then they also help the offensive side get Tyrone Bolden, a wide receiver from Bowling Green, who they're expecting him to also take a breakout. So there's a lot of expectations around Arkansas and their kind of success from last year at points, looking to this year and are really hoping that KJ Jefferson can take that next step and be that number one guy. His leadership is really going to put them over the top. Obviously, the run game is very important. There's a lot of depth, like I said, on the defensive side, but losing a couple guys on that defensive side is tough. And then at wide receiver, there's a lot of them, but you don't know how good they are. You don't know the quality of the receivers you got. But luckily, for their sake, you've gotten rid of the first part of what could be an issue in the offense and what could be the quarterback. You've already taken care of that one, and you have a really good veteran-led quarterback. So, going 7-6 last year, you could be looking towards the same type of route this year. Their line set at 6.5. You're probably looking at around 7 wins again for them this year. I think that their ceiling could be higher. I just don't see where, in comparison to other SEC schools that they're going to have to face on their track, how they kind of fare up against them. I mean, you play LSU at LSU, you play the A&M game in Arlington, and then you play at Ole Miss, at Alabama, at Florida. Like, those are all tough games to even try to stay in with. So, let alone winning them. It's a weird situation for Arkansas, which I think that Sam Pittman's done a great job there over his 3 years after being thrown into the fire his first year pretty much. I think he's going to find a little bit more success over time. I think that KJ Jefferson has a ceiling, and he's kind of already at that ceiling. So it's an interesting. They could always be poised for a breakout if KJ Jefferson keeps improving even better. They could put themselves at a better stage, and obviously Rocket Sanders being the guy at running back makes it really important to have an incredible running back in college football, because you could see that those end up being the deciding factor in a lot of games. So potentially around 7 wins is what you're looking for Arkansas, again, kind of repeating what you did last year. And now we move on to I guess you could say my school, even though I don't go there. I grew up a Florida Gator fan. My mom went to Florida. My sister is going to be going to Florida. So I'm a diehard Gator no matter what. So I'm always going to support them, and I always have a deep love for them. So I guess this is what you can get from me, is listening to me ramble on about this Florida team, which was an odd offseason period for them. Last year, obviously, Billy Napier's first year within the I guess you can call it, with that at the college, is his first year. Went 6-7 with the 7th loss being in the bowl game, which was a terrible loss. Whole situation around Jalen Kitna surrounding that program. Anthony Richardson obviously ended up becoming a top pick. Osiris Torrance also left, became a first rounder. Gervon Dexter left, ended up being, I think he was a mid-second rounder to Chicago. So, interesting spot here, second year for Florida. The big thing that needed to change last year was the defensive side of things and how we identified as a defense. Because if you think of the early 2000s Florida team, sure, you think of Tebow, you think of the Pounces, you think of Percy, but you also think of Major Wright. You think of Joe Hayden, Janoris Jenkins. You think of all these guys on the defensive side, Brandon Spikes, that were all hard-nosed defenders. And you bring in Brandon Spikes as I guess you can call it quote-unquote grad assistant, because he's technically going back and getting his master's right now. But he's going to help out on the coaching staff there. And you bring in Austin Armstrong, who's kind of close in relation to me, as he was the defensive coordinator at Southern Miss, ended up taking the job at Alabama as a linebackers coach. Florida ends up bringing him in to be the full-time defensive coordinator, I guess co-defensive coordinator with Sean Spencer, but Armstrong definitely will be taking the full reign of helm by the end of the season or next year. And when it kind of goes to Florida, when you're talking about the offseason, everyone knew you're losing Richardson. You had to get a quarterback. Sure, DJ Lagway's coming in 2 years' time, but that's going to be a true freshman when he gets in there. You got to get a quarterback for this year, for this team. A lot of people thought Sam Hartman. A lot of people thought Devin Leary. A lot of people thought Grayson McCall, but we get Graham Mertz out of Wisconsin, which is questionable. We were expecting to get a freshman quarterback in by the name of Jaden Rashada that we talked about last episode in the Pac-12, but everybody knows that situation by now with the NIL stuff and him. So glad that whole thing is taken care of and out of the way. We don't got to deal with that anymore. But Graham Mertz is going to be probably the starter. He will definitely be the starter week 1, I'm assuming. But don't be surprised if Max Brown, who is a redshirt freshman, I believe, two-sport athlete, plays baseball. He's either a redshirt freshman or a sophomore. Don't remember if they redshirt him or not. Don't be surprised if he has a chance to end up becoming the starter. Really, really solid arm talent. It's just his footwork, his decision-making. You can see in some of the practices and some of the scrimmages they played, he's targeting onto one receiver only, and he struggles there. But Graham Mertz having a little bit more of a veteran presence. Billy's talked about his leadership role being a big factor, and I think, in a team that lost their quarterback, you need a leader in that room at quarterback. So that was a big thing to get. Whether Mertz is successful or not with the team, having a leader like him in a younger quarterback room is more important than a lot of things. But he's wearing number 15, so there's a lot of prestige that comes with wearing 15. But also on the offensive side of things, really underrated running back room. And I think a lot of people are starting to notice it and how good they are. Montrell Johnson transferred over from Louisiana with Billy last year when he came in. And then Trevor Etienne, obviously brother of Travis, who plays for the Jacksonville Jaguars, formerly of Clemson. Probably one of the best 1-2 running back duos in the SEC, let alone college football. They're fantastic. Slicky Ricky Pearsall at wide receiver. Unofficial nickname Slicky Ricky. That's just what I call him because he is running like Riley Cooper out there, putting on, wearing number 1. He's awesome. And then kind of looking at the rest of the wide receiver room, you got Caleb Douglas and Marcus Burke, who are both sophomores, kind of have some experience last year. You lose Xavier Henderson, which isn't really too much of a loss. Don't really care about that, honestly. But when it comes to the rest of the wide receiver room, you have a couple more true freshmen that are coming in. Aiden Mazel, who is super fast. Eugene Wilson, who probably won't see the field first year, but also really, really, really fast. And Andy Dean, who could find his way on there. That there's a lot of people hyping up that he could really be or Andy Jean, excuse me. I said Andy Jean, but yes, it's with a J. He is very, very, very solid. A lot of people are hyping him up to be the guy. Tight end, don't worry about that. Offensive line, you've had a couple of guys transfer out, but you also get Micah Mazuka to come in and be your starting left guard, taking over for Osiris Torrance. He's transferred in from Baylor. We originally had Keonta Goodwin transfer him from Kentucky, but he had some personal family issues where he had left the program. Obviously, hopefully everything is well there. Sucks that we're not going to have a guy like him anymore, but you got some other guys to help bolster up that offensive line. And then you're kind of looking at the defensive side of things. Obviously, Austin Armstrong being the new defensive coordinator, bringing in a new light. Some guys to return, Justice Boone on the defensive line, Princely Unmanmielen, who is poised for a huge breakout year. Trust me right now, Princely is going to be one of the top edge rushers in the SEC, and that's just not bias. He showed a lot of flashes of it last year when Brenton Cox got dismissed from the program. Princely has a real chance to break out this year. You also bring back Shamar James, who just recently had an ankle injury at practice. Sounds like he's going to be day-to-day, and he's going to be fine. Adam Mobile, he's going to be fantastic as a replacement for a couple of linebackers that had been consistent over the years here at Florida. Jason Marshall being one of the other key guys as our number 1 corner. He was a 5-star freshman coming in, now a junior. Played all 3 years so far coming in. He should be pretty good. They're transitioning to more of a press defense when it comes to the DBs. So you've got guys like Jason Marshall who are going to be fantastic. Devin Moore, who saw a lot of playing time before injury last year. as a true freshman. Jadarius Perkins, who maybe I'm not the biggest fan of all time, but he can tackle. Coverage questionable, but he can tackle for sure. And then Kamari Wilson, 5-star, who is highly touted last year. Saw some time on the field as a true freshman, but is poised to be the guy this year now that Trey Dean, Rashad Torrance, other guys like that are gone. And then Florida ended up going into the transfer portal and shoring up another safety slot in R.J. Moten, a veteran safety from Michigan. Very important piece to that secondary last year for them. Comes over to Florida, gets another chance of his college career here. Terahata Mitchell, a linebacker from Ohio State, who just couldn't find himself healthy enough to stay on the field, and other guys ended up taking over for him, but was very effective his freshman year at Ohio State. He comes over and helps Shamar James, teams up in the linebacking core with them. And then you also go and bolster up that D-line, get Caleb Banks from Louisville and Cam Jackson from Memphis. Both of those guys going to be on that D-line. This team's very interesting, and obviously everybody's quick to say, oh, Florida sucks this year. Florida's going to win 4 games. They're going to win 5 games. They're the worst team in the SEC. Their line's set at 5.5. I think this team has some potential to shock some people. I'm not getting my hopes up too much. I'm just excited to see them play. Obviously, we play at Utah week 1. They came to our place last year and played week 1. We got the win there. I think it's going to be tougher to win there this year, especially with the team we've got. Not really knowing too much. I don't know what the ceiling is for this team. I definitely know what the floor is for this team. The line's set at 5.5. I'm going to say they win around 6. 6 or 7 is a range that I think you could be very comfortable with if you're a Florida fan looking at this year and next year having one of the top recruiting classes already for 2024. I think you're looking at a solid 6 or 7 wins for this team. Don't want to get my hopes up too much. Maybe I'm overestimating this team, or maybe I'm underestimating this team. I just don't think that the pieces are all fully put together yet. I think it's going to be another year until we finally get, what Billy has been building with his true freshman coming in 24. Another year of the transfer portal. He's just starting to figure out how to use the NIL he's been talking about. So I think everything's starting to come together as one here in the next couple of years. I don't know if Graham Mertz is the answer at quarterback. Maybe Max Brown is. Maybe Miller is. Maybe Lagaway ends up being the guy. We don't know. But I do know that this defense is going to be a little bit different than it has been in the past couple of years. And hopefully we have some emerging stars on the skill position-wise on offense with Johnson and ETN being the 2 guys in the backfield. So around 6-7 is probably where you would be overjoyed if you're a Florida fan to see this team kind of repeat what they were last year. As we were in a lot of close games down the stretch and just couldn't pull it off. Hopefully the tide has turned this year and this upcoming season, and things get a little bit better for this team. And now we move on to the defending 2-time national champion Georgia Bulldogs, who in their offseason, it's just a normal Georgia offseason. You lose some guys, you gain some guys. You're still expected to win it all again. Obviously, they lost Jalen Carter, Nolan Smith on the defensive side. Biggest one they lost, Stetson Bennett, their phenom quarterback that rose to stardom out of nowhere. He left for the NFL after his 17th college season. He's finally done. So he was able to move on. You lose A.D. Mitchell, one of your big receivers, which kind of sucks. But you're bringing back the majority of the unit that was there last year. Kendall Milton being the guy at running back now after McIntosh left. You're kind of looking at a really stacked running back room again because it's Georgia. They just have bodies on bodies on bodies to help this team out. But let's talk about their quarterback situation, because the quarterback situation could be the question mark on this team if there is even one. But the standout point on this team is the quarterback. And like I mentioned, losing Stetson Bennett sucks a lot. Right now, Carson Beck is penciled in to be the starting quarterback this year for Georgia. But there's some chances that Brock Vandagriff could find his way in there and get some playing time. Gunnar Stockton, another guy in the quarterback room that could potentially find a chance. I think they like Beck a little bit. He has some more experience already with this team and this offense. I don't know how good he is. We'll just have to see. Obviously, it's Georgia, so you have the weapons around it. We'll talk about those weapons right now. The two big guys that are returning, obviously Ladd McConkey and the superstar tight end Brock Bowers, who everyone loves. I'm a Florida fan. I hate Georgia, but I love Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers is awesome. I'm a sucker for a really good athletic tight end, and Brock Bowers can do that. Broke the record for most rushing yards by a tight end, obviously. He was fantastic. They're just finding ways each year, finding new ways each year to reinvent who he is, kind of how they use him in the offense, and all that kind of stuff. Todd Monken, the offensive coordinator, is no longer there. He's the new OC at Baltimore, I think, now. But they bring in Mike Bobo, who was an analyst for the team last year, so the offense shouldn't change too much. Obviously, the quarterback change is the big issue. The O-line, you're returning all the starters except for two guys, one of them being Ernest Green, who is their top offensive line recruit last year, who's going to finally get a chance to play as a redshirt freshman. And then you move on to the defensive side, and it's like, yeah, sure, we lost Jalen Carter, we lost Nolan Smith, we lost Keely Ringo. Yeah, who really cares when you still got guys like Mykel Williams and Nazir Stackhouse on the defensive line that are fantastic. You also got guys like Kamari Laslater and Javon Bullard in the secondary who are super solid for this team. A couple of younger guys that are maybe going to make their way to stardom for this team. They got Smoke Bowie from A&M as a DB transfer. And then in your freshman class, you have Jordan Hall on the D-line who could potentially find ways to play his freshman year. Raylan Wilson, a linebacker who, behind Jamon Dumas-Johnson and Samel Mondon, he'll find a way to play in there. And we didn't even talk about this other transfer on the offensive side. I just completely skipped over him. Dominic Lovett, coming over from Missouri, just solidifying this wide receiver room of McConkey, Rosemy Jack-Saint, and Lovett just kind of bolster this team. And it's like, that's where you start to think like, hey, yeah, Carson Beck, we don't know if he's any good or not, but who cares? Like, who really cares if you're throwing to guys like this? You're playing in an offense like they do at Georgia that it's just so many moving pieces. You don't really know what's happening. Their offensive line is so skilled and so smart. It's so hard to find ways to say that this Georgia team has dropped off when you keep replenishing tools. And this is the first time in like 3 years that Kirby has jumped into the transfer portal in the offseason and gotten a couple of guys. Lovett being the main one out of all of those. And if you look at Georgia, their line is set at 11.5 wins. I don't see a way that this team loses a game. Sure, the only questionable one would be the Tennessee game. They got to go to Tennessee. I just think that this team is way too good. We're potentially looking at 3 titles for Georgia. I hate it. I really do as a Florida fan. I hate it. But there's a chance that this Georgia team's just repeating once again, despite any quarterback worries, with the rest of the defense being shored up and obviously the skill positions on offense. Next school we'll talk about is Kentucky. And Kentucky, another kind of similar situation that Florida was in, especially in the quarterback situation where you had a top guy playing quarterback last year. They end up going to the draft. They lose Will Levis. You want to look into the transfer portal and see what you can get. They get one of the better guys of the transfer portal quarterbacks in Devin Leary coming over from NC State. He's a big guy to bring in for this Kentucky team that loses a lot of guys on offense. Obviously, Will Levis, we talked about. They lose both of their running backs in Chris Rodriguez and Cavassier Smoke. Smoke ends up going to Colorado. Rodriguez graduates. Justin Rogers on the defensive side, we talked about him going to Auburn. Another guy you lose there. But luckily for them on the offensive side, they've got a couple of proven wide receivers, and Dane Key as a true freshman last year was unbelievable for them, and Tavion Robinson, who is really solid as well. Both of those guys being your two wide receivers is very important to have when getting a new quarterback. They go in the transfer portal and they get Ray Davis out of Vanderbilt, a 1,000-yard rusher there for Vandy last year. Their offensive line is pretty solid, a lot of returning starters on there. And you go to the defensive side of things, Deion Walker on the defensive line, J.J. Weaver, who seems like he's been playing at Kentucky since like 2007. He's still there. In the secondary, you got Jordan Lovett at safety. So you got guys that are all important to this team. And then you go into the transfer portal and add more guys like a J.Q. Hardaway on the defensive side of things. And you kind of shore up a lot of these different positions that you don't really have too much of a worry about anymore. But the big part was, what are you going to do post Will Levis? Luckily for them, they get Devin Leary. They get a guy to come in here and be another veteran-led person that is going to be perfect for this offense here at Kentucky. You kind of look at their schedule, and it's a typical SEC schedule. The teams that they got to play different this year, they got to play Alabama. They're playing at Mississippi State. Those are kind of your two big other SEC West teams that you got to play. And I mean, just the offense is fine. The defense is fine. It's all about how is Leary going to adapt to the SEC play. We know how he did at NC State. He was obviously sought after heavily in the offseason for a reason. It's just how is he going to play here at Kentucky. Their line is set at 6.5 wins. You're probably going to look around 7 again for Kentucky for a team that went 7-6 last year. Probably looking for another 7-win season. It's just questionable kind of with the depth on the defensive side, the depth on the offensive line. You just got to find ways to stay healthy and perform at this high level, because you got the veteran-led guys on the defensive part of things, especially J.J. Weaver being one of those guys. And then offensively, you got your quarterback now. You got your running back, who was really solid last year, already familiar with playing in the conference. So you're kind of at a good spot. I just don't think – it's another part where you see these teams like Arkansas, like Florida, Kentucky we're talking about now, and some other teams that we'll talk about as well. In comparison to the other SEC teams at the top, this team is kind of that tier below it. And you can find a way that Kentucky isn't going to be past around 6, 7, maybe 8 wins this year. And now moving on to a team that I know a lot of people are going to probably be listening to this just for specifically. And we're moving on to another team that last year also made a coaching change and made a little bit of a risk in trying to get a new head coach and a new quarterback, and they do so. And we're going to talk about LSU, who last year with Brian Kelly's first year went 10-4. They bring in Jaden McDaniels. They bring in Jaden Daniels. I'm still in basketball mode sometimes. Jaden Daniels comes over from Arizona State last year, has a great first year, throwing for over 2,900 yards, almost 3,000 yards. A great first year there for him. Now they're all in a second year. You're looking at some of the guys they lose. They lose Kayshon Boutte, who loves dancing with strippers at bowl games. B.J. Ojulari on the defensive thing. Jay Ward, Jack Beck also leaves. So you got a bunch of these depth pieces that are leaving. But luckily, Jaden Daniels is your guy at quarterback. You know what you're getting there. Malik Neighbors, who is a wide receiver, who is a stud for them. He's awesome. And then moving on to the defensive side of things, this is your pride and joy right now with LSU, which has always usually been outside of 2019, 2018. It's been known for their defense and what they do and what they produce. And right now they've got one of the best defenses in college football personnel-wise, led by Mason Smith, who was a true freshman last year who got hurt in week 1. You got other guys like Greg Brooks, who is a safety, who is a stud. Oh, and then we got to mention this guy who is potentially the best pass rusher in all of college football. Him and Jared Verse are probably 1 and 2 right now. And his name's Harold Perkins. And if you did not see him last year as a true freshman, My God, you thought Will Anderson was really good as a freshman. This guy was unbelievable, and he's only poised to get better and better and better. Not draft eligible yet, hence why you don't really hear his name too much because the draft isn't eligible for him. But in 2 years' time, this guy potentially number 1 or number 2, depending on what happens in the quarterback landscape. But this guy is an absolute freak and stud for this team. Last year had 72 tackles, 7.5 sacks as a linebacker. He played in coverage, and he was a pass rusher as well. He's unbelievable. And that's not even mentioning some other guys in this linebacking core. They went into the transfer portal and got Omar Spates, a guy from Oregon State we talked about last episode, who is a really, really, really solid player. They get Deuce Chestnut, Zy Alexander, and Denver Harris, all DB transfers who are all going to make an impact immediately and be depth pieces with some other DBs that went to the draft, transferred. And then kind of that offense we're looking at. You kind of have a running back game where it's running back by committee. Right now, Josh Williams is penciled in to be the number 1 guy, but they're really not afraid to use a bunch of the other guys that they got in that room. Offensive line is solid. It's just really down to LSU winning those big games. Last year, you were able to pull it off. You didn't pull off the LSU or the FSU one in week 1. We all know what happened there at the end with the field goal and that whole situation. But you were able to pull off some of these other big wins, talking about Florida on the road, which is always a tough one no matter how good Florida is. No matter how good we are, always playing at Florida is a tough one. You beat Ole Miss. You beat Alabama, right? You lose, but then you lose to A&M. You lose to Tennessee. You get killed by Tennessee. Some of those bad losses that stop them from taking that next step. I think in year 2 with Brian Kelly, you're kind of looking to maybe take that next step to where they can get over that hump and win these important games. You get your rematch against FSU again week 1. You play Arkansas at home. You have to go to Ole Miss this year. That's a tough one. You got to go to Alabama this year. You got your win last year at home against them. Now you got to go to Alabama, which always seems to be a defensive battle when they play at Alabama. The LSU-Alabama games always seem to be a defensive game. You play Florida at home, luckily. So you're kind of looking at some of these games, but you got to play at home that you had to play on the road last year that, maybe give you a little bit better chance. It's all going to be down to week 1, I think. That sets the tone against FSU, another top team in the country that I have personally ranked both top 10 teams in the country. LSU can really start their season off on a good note if they can take down Florida State after losing last year. Obviously, Mason Smith, you're getting him back. Can Harold Perkins avoid the sophomore slump? Can Jaden Daniels kind of take that next step in his development here his senior year and really lead this team? Your weapons on offense, there's a lot of them. You don't know what you got yet, but you at least have Malik Neighbors, who is pretty good, was a 1,000-yard receiving guy last year. You got guys. You got to figure out who they are, how important they are. Kyron Lacey, another dude in that wide receiver core that could potentially break out, 6'2", 210 senior. It's a tough situation for LSU to kind of see that they're listed at 9.5 wins, and you're probably looking around 9 or 10 is the area where you're looking for their total wins. I think this team's really solid. I really do. I think their defense is really fantastic. It's all going to be about those skill positions. Can you find a way to really take yourself over the top with the running backs or with your wide receivers? Who's going to be that number 1 guy like Kayshon Boutte was going to be, like you had Justin Jefferson, like you had Jamar Chase? Who's going to be that guy to step out? I think LSU still has a very successful year. 9 to 10 wins is going to be a great year for them in year 2 with Brian Kelly. And now a team that we're going to move on to obviously had a very unfortunate situation happen last year around the bowl season when their head coach, Mike Leach, passed away. Mississippi State's in a weird position. They immediately hired Zach Arnett to be the head coach, who was already there last year, hired him in right as the bowl game was about to happen. This team's in a very odd spot. Talk about some of the guys they lost. They lost Emmanuel Forbes, their top DB. He went in the late first round, second round. He was their top guy last year. You lose Ra Thomas. He transfers in conference. Dylan Johnson, another dude they lose. But the good thing for them is they're bringing back their quarterback in Will Rogers. Now, how good is that if you're a Mississippi State fan? You don't know. He's questionable at times. It's another one of those Mississippi State quarterbacks who are not afraid to put their body on the line and not afraid to throw themselves around on the field. And that tends to be a risk at times because you're breaking into those depth pieces on offense at quarterback position, or at the quarterback position specifically, in which Will Rogers already isn't one of the top quarterbacks, but it's a weird situation all around. Luckily, Jaquavius Marks is your running back, and he is a stud for this team. I really like him a lot. They're going to continue the air raid offense, obviously, so Will Rogers needs some guys to get some help at receiver. Your returning starter, Jaden Wally, he's going to be there. You'll break into the transfer portal a little bit to get some wide receiver help, I guess tight end help, and Sadeu Traore, a transfer from Colorado, and Jerquarius Spivey, both tight ends that are going to come in and give you some help there. You also get a couple of recruits. Creed Whittemore, brother of Trent Whittemore, now at UCF, formerly at Florida. He's going to be one of your top guys to look out for at wide receiver. You can't miss him, trust me. He's got long blonde hair, white kid. You can't really miss him. But offense, when you talk about a Mike Leach, well, I guess it's not a Mike Leach-led offense anymore, rest in peace, but kind of the same idea of the offense that they ran last year. When you think of that, you never think of any issue at all. You always think of the defense. This is the rare occasion where an air raid offense isn't the best thing. You look at their defense, Jaden Crumity and Nathan Pickering are two guys on that defensive line that are really effective for this team. They really like a lot. Decamarion Richardson is your standout DB to take over for Forbes now. And you also go out and you get Kamari Rogers, a DB from Miami, who's going to be a stud. Isaac Smith, who's a safety, can find his way to start this year as a true freshman. Marcus Banks, who is a senior, is a stud, can help this team out a lot. Mississippi State's at this weird point, again, like I just talked about, where you have a new head coach. Obviously, everybody mourning the loss of Mike Leach within the program, within college football still. So Mississippi State's at this weird crossroad right now. Their total wins are listed at 6.5. You're probably looking around the 6-win range. They're still a good enough team. Unfortunately, you got to play LSU. You still got to play Alabama. You got to play at Arkansas, at Auburn, at A&M. You got to play Kentucky. You got to play Ole Miss. Like, these are some tough games that you're playing against teams that are just a little bit better than you are right now. And that's okay to have happen. It's a new head coach. Obviously, things are going to change. It's just unfortunate to see the light of the situation and how it's happened. But like I said, that defense is kind of be the bright spot if you're a Mississippi State fan. Two guys we didn't talk about, Jet Johnson and Nathaniel Watson at linebacker. Very good linebacking core as well. We didn't even talk about that. That's a very good linebacking core to help out. And with a team that you're playing against really good high-power offenses, you need guys that can secure the middle of the field and tackle guys. I feel like that's a pretty important part of football to have done. But it's just a question on offense. Who's all going to be an important part of that offense? Who are all going to be the guys to step up and be the ones to help Will Rogers out as he throws his body around the field for no apparent reason at all? Mississippi State, again, 6 wins is probably good, which makes them one of the bottom teams in the SEC. But that's just the fate of playing in one of the best conferences in college football. 6 wins puts you at the bottom. But I think Mississippi State is in a transition period now at a new head coach where they're still trying to find their new identity outside of Mike Leach not being there anymore. And then transitioning on to another one of the lower teams, I guess you can say, in the SEC this year, and then Missouri. Missouri, another situation where they're building for the future. Eli Drinkwitz, obviously, building a good program there. It's just going to take some more time for them They lose some guys. Dominic Lovett, we talked about transferring over to Georgia, and then other guys leaving. Isaiah McGuire, Hiron White, Trehan Jeffcoat, all leaving. But luckily, you're bringing back your starting quarterback in Brady Cook, which questionable at times, but productive quarterback nonetheless for this team and this offense. And then you also bring back the big surprise that a lot of people didn't see coming last year when he committed to Missouri. But number one receiver in the recruiting class last year, Luther Burden III. A lot of rumors about him entering the transfer portal, going to a bigger school, maybe getting a little bit more money. He stays at home with Missouri. He's from there, so he stays in his hometown and takes another shot with this team and this offense that is already still trying to boost themselves up a little bit more. They go into the transfer portal, get Cameron Johnson and Marcellus Johnson, both offensive linemen, and they get Theo Weiss from Wisconsin to also paired along with him after losing Dominic Lovett. But unfortunately for them, on the defensive side of things, you're really just returning a lot of guys in a defense that ranked 55th overall in scoring, and they were the 33rd ranked team in total yards per game, only giving up 340. So you're not really getting anybody new on that side, but it's not too bad of a thing when you have a lot of guys returning. Darius Robinson being one of the guys on that defensive line that is going to head up that team. Also on the defensive side at DB, Ennis Rakestraw, a junior who is not afraid to talk his crap if you know anything. Chris Abrams-Drain, who is pretty good as well. And then that linebacking core, Chad Bailey, a 6', 234 senior, and Tyron Hopper, former Florida Gator, middle linebacker, outside linebacker, who is very, very solid in his own right as well. Missouri is another situation where there's just teams in this conference that are better than them right now, and that's okay. They're still building. The recruiting classes are starting to get a little bit better. It's just right now there's better teams than Missouri are right now. Brady Cook is the starter, but that could easily change. People don't know what they're going to go with at quarterback. There are multiple options, including Jake Garcia coming over from Miami. He could potentially be the starter. Brady Cook could potentially be the starter. They don't really know. Luckily, they got a little bit of time. They got 2 weeks until they play Kansas State, so they have some time to figure out what's going on there. But their defense is going to be their big thing that they pride themselves on this year. Again, their line is set at, 6.5? Again, unfortunately, you are at the expense of being in the SEC where you are not one of the top schools right now. So you're probably looking for another around 6-win season. But for other conferences, that's pretty, hey, all right, you get 6 wins. In the SEC, you get 6 wins, you suck. You're the worst team. So Missouri's kind of at this weird crossroad right now where they're still trying to develop this offense, but luckily their defense is going to keep them in games and make them a spoiler watch for a lot of teams going down the stretch. Moving back into the upper echelon of teams in the SEC, we go to Oxford and we talk about Ole Miss. And Ole Miss is a very interesting situation, primarily because of what's going on at quarterback. Obviously, last year, Jackson Dart was the guy for them as a true freshman. Showed some flashes, was really impressive, but also showed some errors as a true freshman normally would. They went into the transfer portal, and they got 2 more quarterbacks. They got Walker Howard, who coming over from LSU, not really sure how much he's going to end up playing. He'd be a future piece for them. And then more of the guy that you're looking at potentially for now. You go into the portal again to get another quarterback, and you get Spencer Sanders, quarterback from Oklahoma State, who is a little bit more veteran presence. Right now, Lane Kiffin has not named a starter. It's probably going to be Sanders or Dart. I would guess they go with Dart to start off with, and if Dart isn't impressing them, Sanders goes in because of the experience. I don't see Walker Howard really playing a role into this team offensively this year unless everybody gets hurt, which hopefully that's not the case for them. But that's a very weird situation where you have 3 really solid quarterbacks that you just really don't know who to decide from. But luckily for them, it don't matter who's playing at quarterback because all you got to do is hand it off to number 4, Quinshon Judkins, who is one of the best running backs in college football, if not the best. 1,500 rushing yards last year, 16 touchdowns, averaged 120 yards per game, 5.7 yards per carry. He is an absolute stud for this team, a sophomore. The offense is going to run through him no matter what. You still got guys like Jordan Watson, who's going to be really good. Caden Preekscorn, who is also a solid tight end for them as well. You go and also get Zachary Franklin from UTSA, who is unbelievable. He's going to be your number 1 guy for this team this year on this offense. So you're kind of playing with some guys here on offense. They lose Jonathan Mingo and Zach Evans, and they go ahead and get 2 more guys to kind of replace them, even though Zach Evans kind of took a backseat last year to Judkins. And if you look at the defense, their whole defensive line is returning. The most notable guy on that defensive line to talk about is Cedric Johnson, who's going to be manning up the middle, who is a senior, 6'3", 265. They expect a lot out of him. And then the rest of the defense is kind of taking over for the losses of some of the guys like Tavius Robinson, Davison Igmison, who transferred away. You're kind of replacing those guys. So at linebacker, they went out and they got Sutrain Perkins, who's going to be a really good true freshman, was a 5-star. You also get Zamari Walton, a DB from Georgia Tech. He's going to add to that kind of depth. You get Jeremiah Jean-Baptiste, who transfers in. He's going to be good. So you're getting a lot more depth pieces. But for Ole Miss, when you're kind of looking at this team, it's all about can they stop the run. Last year, they were one of the worst in the SEC, giving up 168 rushing yards per game, which is not very good in comparison to other schools in the SEC. Florida being one of the only other teams to have that low of a defensive, statistic against the rush. It's a questionable one for them, but luckily for them, Judkins on the offensive side can counteract anything another team can do when it comes to running. Their line is set right now at 7.5 wins. I think they exceed that a little bit. They're going to win probably 8. It just depends on what's going on with quarterback. If Sanders is there, I see them winning a lot more than they do with Dart. Granted, Sanders doesn't have the same arm talent that Dart does or the same potential, but Sanders is a game manager. He's played in big games before. He's played in plenty of college games before at another conference high-level offense at Oklahoma State in the Big 12. So he understands the situation and how to play. Obviously, the SEC is a different beast than the Big 12 is, but when you want experience and you need experience, you get experience. And experience isn't something you lose depending on what conference you go to. We see with a lot of low FCS transfers to go to big schools and become big players. So Ole Miss, their season is going to be completely reliant on what the quarterback situation is, how they manage that, and can they stop the run finally? Because at the end of the season last year, it was rough. So you're probably going to look around 8 wins for Ole Miss this year. I don't think you're going to be looking at a disappointing team. I like this team a little bit more than a lot of people do. But again, it's just all that quarterback situation, how it's going to really truly break down and just kind of solve out for that team. The next school we talk about is an interesting one as well. And they kind of emerged onto the scene late last year, although making some splashes here and there throughout the past couple years under head coach Shane Beamer, and that is South Carolina. I talk about them breaking onto the scene last year, kind of making a name for themselves after beating Kentucky and A&M, and then making the big upset against Tennessee 63-38, and then absolutely squashing Clemson's chances of making the playoffs last year in the final week, going into Clemson and beating them there. They're all backed behind starting quarterback Spencer Rattler, who you can make fun of him all you want for his time at Oklahoma, for his hype being as high as he is, for how much he talks. But towards the end of the year last year, after getting killed by Florida and getting picked off by a 300-pound defensive lineman in Desmond Watson. He kind of turned the page over after that loss and immediately took it to Tennessee and to Clemson, kind of ruining both of their chances in making the playoffs that year. But kind of the rest of the offense, you bring back another couple wide receivers in Antoine Wells and Xavier Legette. You lose Jaheim Bell at tight end, which kind of sucks. And you lose Jordan Burch as well, which kind of sucks as well. But who really cares? You're bringing in Nick Harbor, a 5-star wide receiver. Trey Knox transfer in from Arkansas to play tight end. He's going to immediately start. He's wearing number 1. So on the offensive side, you're not really losing too much. You have Juju McDowell, who is going to take over now after Marshawn Lloyd ended up transferring out. Juju McDowell is going to take over there. And then the offensive line is very inexperienced, and that's kind of a very big key for this offense is the experience on the offensive line. But for defensively, you'll lose a lot of these guys: Cam Smith, Zach Pickens, Darius Rush. You lose a bunch of these guys. Luckily, you have Muhammad Kaba and Nick Emenwari, who are both returning to this defense. DQ Smith, also another name. Marcellus Dial, also in that secondary. But you bring in Jatius Gear, a defensive lineman from Syracuse, who's awesome. You bring in Jaron Williams, an edge rusher from Ole Miss, who's awesome. And then a 4-star linebacker, Grayson Howard, who could easily see the field his freshman year. All of those guys are going to kind of make an impact for this South Carolina team, but the most notable thing is knowing what South Carolina special teams can do. They always create havoc in special teams games and kind of dictate how the game is played through special teams. Shane Beamer is not afraid to take chances there. Right now, a lot of people have them as a top 25 team, and I don't know how much you want to think about that. Their line is set at 6.5 wins. I really don't see how South Carolina this year, obviously, if you look at the recruiting rankings for 2024, they are killing it right now. I'm not afraid to admit that. But right now, I don't see how South Carolina is as good as a lot of people are expecting. I think that those last 2 games last year were kind of the breakout and the ceiling that you can have with this team. Losing a lot of guys on that defense sucks. Sure, you get your offensive weapons back, but defensively, it's going to be hard to recreate what you had in a lot of those guys. So you're probably going to look at around 7 wins for South Carolina, 7 to 8. I don't want to downplay them too much like they're not good at all. Like, they're a solid program led by a solid head coach. I just don't see how they're hyped up as much as some of these other schools that aren't even hyped up too much that we'll get into, and we already have talked about. Being one of those schools being Ole Miss. I don't see how this South Carolina team's better than them. And if you're telling me it's because Spencer Rattler, then are you telling me that 4 weeks of Spencer Rattler last year is good enough to make a judgment? Then I don't know. It's just very odd. I don't see the South Carolina team doing too much more than around 7 wins this year and recreating kind of the success that they had last year at an 8-win season. And now a lot of people that I know are fans of this team, and they've been waiting to hear this one. We go on over to Knoxville to Rocky Top Land, and we talk about Tennessee that last year had all signs of going to the playoffs if it weren't for that South Carolina game that we just previously mentioned there, and their starting quarterback in Hendon Hooker tearing his ACL and not being able to play in that game, the rest of that game or the next week. Or even give them a chance to potentially get in there. Obviously, losing to Georgia was kind of the final blow because it didn't get you to the SEC title game. But you got a big win against Alabama. They took down the goalpost after that one. You almost lost to Florida, but you ended up winning that one. You win a couple more. You beat LSU. You kill LSU, rather. You beat Kentucky. You kill Missouri. You kill a bunch of these other teams. And Tennessee this year is in an interesting spot, especially with the recruiting class that they got. They lose a couple guys, mainly offensively. You lose Hendon Hooker. You're losing your 2 big receivers in Jalen Hyatt and Cedric Tillman. You lose your offensive coordinator as he moves on to be the head coach at USF now. So a new guy calling plays, although same scheme under Heupel. And then defensively, you only really lose Jordan Phillips as your main guy. And if you're looking at the offensive side of things, you bring in a new 5-star freshman and Nico Lamavia. Don't even ask me to pronounce that. I don't know how to. I just know his name is Nico, and he was a 5-star, and he's really supposed to be really good. But he's not going to probably be starting for them this year as Joe Milton takes over at the helm at quarterback. He's fantastic. Has not thrown an interception in his college career. A lot of people remember him and know him as the incident against Ole Miss, not knowing the time, not knowing the situation. But he's grown from then, gotten a lot better than he was at that point. Showed that against Clemson in the bowl game last year, which it's a bowl game, so take of it what you will. But on offense, your weapons are still really good. Brew McCoy is your number one wide receiver who plays more kind of like a tight end. I guess he's more shaped like a tight end than he is a wide receiver. But it kind of complements with how Squirrel White and Rymel Keaton, who are super quick and super athletic, can kind of play for them. They love them a lot. Their offensive line returning 3 of their 5 starters. They're still a really solid team on that end of things. And then you bring in another dude in the transfer portal on the offensive lineman, Andre Karic, who's going to take place. And we didn't even talk about the running back room that is super stacked. Some people have Jabari Small being the number one running back, and the other sites have Jalen Wright being the number one running back, and that's a good thing when you have 2 guys that are going to be your top backs, because that 1-2 punch is going to be scary for Tennessee. And that's not even talking about Dylan Sampson, who last year had 397 yards and 6.8 yards per carry, who is going to be an instant factor for this team as well. And then you kind of look at the defensive side of things. Or actually, let's stay on the offensive side because we didn't talk about another dude, Dante Thornton, who comes over from Oregon, who is a standout guy there under Bo Nix. In that offense, he comes over to help bring more depth to Tennessee in that receiving core that already is just an incredibly quick and athletic core. Now moving on to the defense, like I said, you lose Jordan Phillips, but it's okay because Big Omari Thomas is going to be manning up the middle for Tennessee. Shout out Memphis, he's awesome. Aaron Beasley, kind of the main guy in that linebacking core. That's going to take over. Tamari McDonald, who is playing their star position. He's really good. And you go into the portal and you get Keenan Peely, another linebacker from BYU, another guy with experience. He's going to help out this team. And then some true freshmen in Arian Carter potentially can find his way playing. Davion Hobbs can also find his way playing at some point this year. Tyler Barron, another guy who's a senior on the defensive line. But the real question still always has been for Tennessee, what is that secondary going to do? You might have an incredible offense. It's what's that secondary going to do? Luckily, a lot of these guys coming back kind of have another year under their belt now. Christian Charles being one of those guys, Danico Slaughter being another guy, Jalen McCullough at safety. A lot of these guys having some experience, another year under the system and within the program, maybe gives them an extra motivational step, seeing how last year ended. Maybe they want to erase anything that they want to have that happened last year, because they were 126th in all of college football in pass defense, giving up 289.5 passing yards per game. That's not very good. I'm no mathematician, but that's not pretty good. But looking at Tennessee, their win total is set at 9.5. I think they easily get that. I think they're easily 10 wins. You can look at 11. Your toughest games, again, this is not biased. It's just because it's a rivalry game and you're on the road. You're playing Florida. That's always a Florida-Tennessee game, always going to be something no matter what, wherever it's played. South Carolina, you have that marked on your schedule. You want to get revenge for last year. You got to go to Alabama. That'll be one of your tougher ones. But luckily, you get Georgia at home, so you're hoping, if you're Tennessee, that bringing Georgia to your place gives you a little bit of an advantage over them in comparison to going to their place last year. I still think that there's room for 1 or 2 losses on this schedule. It just depends on how Milton plays in a full season. It depends on the health. It depends on the defensive back room. It's just all a question right now. But there is no question that Josh Heupel has built himself a really good program here at Tennessee with a great recruiting core for this year, next year, and the year after that. Tennessee's program is starting to be on the rise once again. But it's all going to be down to how can this defensive secondary hold down, because you already know how incredibly athletic, incredibly fast that offense is ran. How will Milton kind of adapt to that offense for an entire season? We'll just have to see. And kind of boiling down to the final 2 teams here, we'll first talk about Texas A&M, that they have a whole situation that's outside of what's going on the field, really, that they got to worry about. They always are at the top of the recruiting rankings, and that's fantastic, but then they all just leave. And speaking of leaving, we'll talk about some of the guys they lose. Davon Akane, their running back, Jalen Jones on the defensive side, Denver Harris defensively, and Tumis Adelaide also defensively. They all are gone. You bring back Connor Wagman, who don't really know how good he is. He showed some flashes last year. They still have Max Johnson on the roster, the lefty transfer from LSU. He's still there and could potentially be the starting quarterback. Who really knows? You got other guys on this offensive side, like Evan Stewart, a stud sophomore wide receiver. Noah Thomas, who's also a stud. You bring in a couple of these other guys, like Raymond Cottrell, shout out Pensacola. He's going to come in and make an immediate impact for them. And then Reuben Owens is going to be their starting running back, a 5-star who's immediately going to be thrown into the fire. He is just that talented enough to be able to play. Offensive line, you're bringing back 3 of 5 returning starters. One of those being Trey Zune III, who is a sophomore that people like a lot there at A&M, so keep an eye out for his name. And then defensively, Walter Nolan was one of the top defensive line recruits last year. He gets another year. Bryce Anderson at DB, he's going to make some noise as well there into his second year. He was a true freshman last year. Tyreek Chappell, another guy that they like a lot there. So you got some guys that are returning, but you also bring in some new guys. Tony Grimes, a DB from UNC, will help that depth. Sam McCall, a DB from FSU, he's going to help that depth. And then your top-ranked recruit last year, DJ Hicks, who is going to help that defensive line a little bit with Walter Nolan kind of being there. He might not see the field as much as freshman year, but he could be a good rotational guy with injuries or throughout the season in any way. I just don't know what to think of this LSU team or this A&M team, honestly, because you got the former LSU quarterback and Max Johnson that could potentially be the starter, but you also got Connor Wagman who could also be the starter. I think they got a way bigger issue to figure out in that aspect within recruiting and everything as well. Jimbo is starting to kind of realize that he has too many tools at his extent, you know. Like having the NIL is perfect and all to help build your program, but how helpful is it when none of these guys are staying? They get the money, they commit to your program, and they're like, all right, I'm not playing, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave and go play for another school that's going to let me play, because that's ultimately, I'm a football player and I want to play. That's kind of the mindset of a lot of these guys, I think. So A&M's at a weird position. Their total wins are set at 7.5 this year. I mean, this team, if they're fully healthy and they play to a very high level, they could probably get 8 wins. But you're probably looking 7, honestly, if you're looking at A&M. You got to play at Miami week 2. You got to still play Arkansas. You got to play Alabama. You got to play at Tennessee. You got to play South Carolina, at Ole Miss, at LSU. Like, these are tough games you got to play. And I don't know if they're just the same level as these other top-tier schools in the SEC. They fall in the same realm as Arkansas, Kentucky, South Carolina. Just that second group of schools that it's like, all right, you're the next tier down, so good luck trying to compete with the rest of these schools that are just more advanced than you are in their rebuilding process. And then moving on to the final team, we'll quickly go over them just because we all know the persona and the aura around Vanderbilt. Last year had a great year in comparison to years prior, winning 5 games. But you also lose all guys that are really good, including your starting running back in Ray Davis. He's gone. But you return A.J. Swan at quarterback, who was really good for your team last year, who ended up taking over midway through the year. He was your guy. You also have Will Shepard, Quincy Skinner, and Jaden McGowan, all as your wide receivers. Moving on to the defensive side of things, you got Ethan Barr at linebacker, C.J. Taylor at linebacker. Both of those guys are really good. Jalen Mahoney, who plays safety but also isn't afraid to play linebacker, is an undersized guy. You go into the portal and you get Prince Colley to help shore up some of that outside linebacker help. Aeneas De Cosmo, another linebacker you bring in to kind of be an edge guy as well. When you think of Vandy, you're not thinking of too great of a football program, and that's okay. They're still trying to figure things out there. Clark Lee is trying to figure stuff out. I think the promising thing to look at is when you look at their depth chart and you look at a lot of these guys, a lot of returning guys, and that's promising if you're Vanderbilt. Because the issue has been you get a really good guy in your program and he leaves. Ray Davis is a prime example from this year. He's gone now. He plays at Kentucky. I just think you look at the schedule. You got Hawaii and A&M. Those should be easy wins. You got UNLV. Those should be easy wins. Then you play at Wake Forest as your out-of-conference Power 5 game. That's tough. And then the rest of the SEC schedule is always tough no matter what. The total win is set at 3.5. They're probably going to be the worst team in the SEC this year, winning about 4. I think you can take one of those one or two SEC games, honestly, maybe get you to 5. But you win all those out of conference games that at least get you 3. If you lose out the rest of your SEC schedule and the Wake Forest game, that puts you at 3. So you can potentially get 4 there. So I think they get around 4 wins, winning all of their out of conference games, maybe taking one of those SEC games, but not too much promise for Vandy this year. But the promising thing is that football is just right around the corner. It's an exciting time. This was the longest episode I'm probably ever going to do. If you've made it this far, I don't know what you're doing with your life right now that you've made it an hour and 17 minutes in. But thank you. I try to talk about stuff I know, and the SEC is what I know the most out of any college football conference. So I'm a little bit more passionate to talk about this, including my team is in here. So that helps a little bit with me being able to talk more about it. But I know a large majority of my audience and my friends and fans all are SEC schools or are fans of SEC teams, attend SEC schools. So I wanted to be able to give an outlet and an extensive breakdown on all these programs just so I can cover every basis for people that could listen. Again, you made it this far. I appreciate you so much. There's going to be timestamps. If you want to go back and listen to a certain program that I talked about, definitely can do that. If you sim to the very end just to hear what I got to say to wrap it up, welcome and go back and go listen. There's going to be timestamps. There's not going to be an episode Friday because this was an hour and 20 minutes probably by the time I finish recording here in a minute and a half. So there's not going to be an episode Friday. Football's right around the corner. The next episode that we'll end up doing probably is going to be kind of covering all the other top schools from the other conferences, like the American, the CUSA, the Sun Belt. Got to talk about the flying damn Golden Eagles. They're going to be coming in hot this year. Got to talk about the Notre Dames, the Tulanes, all these other schools. Those are kind of what we'll cover next. And then right after we're done with that, we're starting games up that next weekend pretty much. So we are right there around the corner from football. Hopefully some of you guys are enjoying some other sports that are on, baseball being the most notable. NFL camps are starting. Preseason starts this week. Preseason games start this week in the NFL. MLB, we got fight night happening in the MLB. My team sucks. We don't even want to talk about that because that'll make me be even more depressed about it. But I appreciate you guys all for listening and sticking with me through this long-ass episode. Like I said, there's going to be different things in the description, different timestamps to be able to go to whatever school you're trying to learn about or just hear my thoughts about, I guess. So I appreciate you guys more than you could ever know. No episode Friday. See you next Monday. I'm Alex McNinch, and you got your Sports Digest.